and welcome to this special edition of The Debate. This evening, we're going to be talking about the Premier League statement that was released earlier today. We'll also talk about the ongoing effect of the coronavirus on football in this country and asking how you can make plans for an uncertain future. To discuss that, in Manchester, Jamie Carragher and Gary Neville. And here in the studio, providing all the facts and a cool head, Bryan Swanson. But first, let's talk to Jamie and Gary about the significance of football at a time when all our focus is on people whose lives have been seriously affected by this terrible virus. Why is football important, Gary?
Well, it's critically important, obviously, to the country. It's the _1 sport, the thing that's watched by most people. It's also, for me, I think, the sport that should lead, not just, obviously, in sporting issues, but also in social issues as well. I think it has such an incredible impact. Essentially, that's why I was a little critical a week or so ago of the Premier League when they said that they were going to proceed with the football matches over the weekend, when there was so much sort of intelligence from around Europe and around the world that essentially a different decision should have been made. I know you could argue that you would follow government guidelines, but essentially I do think sport is, and football should be at the forefront of decisive decision making and where leadership should come from. And obviously it's going to be a huge loss to many people in this country, but essentially the most primary concern of everybody at this moment in time will be health first and foremost, and football comes well down the line in terms of important matters.
No, I agree with Gary what he's saying there in terms of we know health and family coming first, but I also think we shouldn't be embarrassed to say how much we sort of want football back at the right time and how much it actually means to people. And everywhere you go now, yes, we're talking about people's health, family, loved ones especially, but also we want to know when maybe could the football be back, because it does, this country and certainly the cities we're from, a lot of people in those cities revolve around the football, so it is a massive part of communities and keeping people together in that spirit. So yes, of course, it's nowhere near as important as the issues that we're talking about and the reason why football has stopped. But I also don't think there's nothing wrong in actually sort of admitting and sort of celebrating how much actually football means to us, and actually when it does come back, what it could do for society and different types of people.
We talk a lot about football being the global game, about the Premier League particularly and its global reach. Is this an opportunity to use that for real good?
Yes, absolutely. I think, like Jamie just said, I think that football brings hope to people, to so many people, and I think I talked about football taking the lead. I think essentially in moments like this, obviously the governments can lead, and I think in the last few days people have welcomed statements that are starting to come out of government around support packages that will essentially give reassurance to families and to employees, to businesses and all the people who need reassurance at this moment in time in the country. They need reassurance on health, but they also need economic reassurance. And I think that football again can lead the way. I think the decision that's been made today by the Premier League, EFL and other leagues to suspend footballers from training till essentially, I think it's April the 5th, and essentially saying that football will not return before April the 30th is a positive one, because I think, one, it primarily deals with the health concerns that people have at this moment in time in terms of protection of football players, staff, coaches, non-playing staff, but also, more, as importantly, the fans that will attend games. But I think it also, from a second point of view, allows football to assess the economic impact on its own game and what essentially they've got to deal with here. I'm not just talking about the Premier League. In fact, I'm more talking about the EFL clubs, the National League clubs and clubs beyond that, who essentially, I would imagine at this moment in time, are doing some deep dive on their accounts, on their revenue losses, what costs they're going to have to incur, what responsibilities they have to their staff and their employees. And I think the Premier League, and I do point towards the Premier League, I know that people will say that the FA is the governing body, that there's the PFA, there's the LMA, but let's be clear here, the Premier League is the power and force in English football. And I think there is a massive opportunity in this next few weeks, when they've got the economic impact assessed across their own league, but also the leagues throughout football, to not only reassure employees, staff, football fans that essentially there's going to be a game there and clubs there to support at the end of this, But I think with the money that is awash in the Premier League, I think there is also an opportunity for the Premier League to lead the way in terms of what they can do for potentially the health service for the community. And they have to essentially look at health first, the economic impact of their own business and their own clubs and their own staff next. But then beyond that, they do have to make a statement, I believe, that essentially goes out there to help communities and the people of communities. I think footballers, there is a massive opportunity for footballers here, and we're sat here as two ex-footballers, and we're not sat here as two ex-footballers who I think are talking this way because we are no longer employed by football clubs who essentially have got, you know, income streams. But there is I saw Borussia Mönchengladbach, I think a club in Germany, have just, I think, announced this afternoon that they're willing to donate their wages to non-playing staff for the next few months. There is a massive opportunity for football players here to grab, essentially defeat, a victory from defeat in what is obviously a terrible time for the whole country, and give some reassurance to people that everybody in football are human beings and that they aren't just in it for the money. Football can act positively, I think, and there's a big opportunity that exists if in the next few weeks they can assess the economic impact upon football itself.
We will return to that on some of the things that football has already done in a positive sense and the ways in which it can improve and which it can help. But Gary referenced there the meeting that the Premier League members had today. What came out of that and what can you tell us, Bryan?
Well, Kelly, what we saw was a joint statement from football, the FA, the Premier League, the EFL, the PFA and the League Managers Association. There was unanimous agreement to extend the suspension in the English game, suspended until at least the 30th of April. Tellingly, within that statement, there was the revelation that the FA board had been meeting as well today, and they agreed for the time limit to the end of the season to be extended indefinitely. That's to say there is no fixed date now to the end of this season. The FA rules and regulations previously said the season should be terminated no later than the 1st of June. It's unprecedented that the FA has changed its own rules mid-season, but it gives you an indication of the seriousness of this situation. They know that the spread of coronavirus remains unclear. They say that they want to reassure everyone the health and welfare of players, staff and supporters as being their priority, but saying that their thoughts are with everyone affected by coronavirus. But Kelly, the main point to come out of today's meeting in that conference call involving all 20 clubs is that they want to do the very best that they can do, in their words, to maintain the integrity of competitions and finish a season.
As you mentioned, we know that the future is unclear, but there has been a statement by the Prime Minister today in which he's tried to outline some kind of a future.
We are seeing daily briefings now with Boris Johnson and the government's health advisors, and clearly we are all looking to them, and sport is looking to them for some guidance, because what football continually says time and again, and has said in the last couple of weeks, is that they are being driven absolutely by what government is saying. And the thoughts of Boris Johnson today, within the last couple of hours or so, very much that he sees potentially some light at the end of this very dark tunnel in the next 12 weeks.
I wanted to try to say something today about how I see the timescale of this campaign and where we're going and what we need to do. And I do think, looking at it all, that we can turn the tide within the next 12 weeks, and I'm absolutely confident that we can send a coronavirus packing in this country, but only if we take the steps, we all take the steps that we have outlined, and that is vital because that is how we're going to reduce the peak. And once we've achieved that, and I think that we will, if we do take the steps that I've said, then the scientific progress that we're making will really start to come into play.
The combination of those two statements today seem to point towards the planning for the future. We know that it is still uncertain times. The Prime Minister talking in terms of 12 weeks. The Premier League realistically talking in terms of at least the 30th of April. What did you make of the response by the Premier League, Gary?
I thought the response from the Premier League today was a positive one. I think that essentially they need to buy themselves some time purely on the health grounds to start with, but I think essentially to look at the, say, economic impact next for clubs, not just in the Premier League but beyond that. I'd hate to think, I mean, I'm sure the Premier League are in close liaison with the EFL, with the National League and other non-league associations around the country to ensure that, again, essentially the game is propped up. The idea that the Premier League, the idea that football comes out of the coronavirus crisis where clubs have gone to the wall because of basically there not being a package in place from essentially the Premier League, which has got all the money, is horrific. So I cannot think that that's not going to happen. I'm sure that the Premier League are looking at that as we speak. Listening to Boris Johnson there, I'd prefer to hear from Rishi Sunak. He gives me far more comfort than the Prime Minister, to be honest with you. Listening to the Chancellor yesterday, I felt as though he had a handle on the situation. I feel as though we need to hear more from him because essentially I think he needs to look at other areas that he didn't cover in that initial address a couple of days ago. And we have got the recent learnings of the recession of 2007-8. We've got the 9/11 crisis, which was 20 years ago. There are some recent learnings which would suggest that the government should be in a good position to be able to handle what needs to happen here, because there is an absolute mess out there from a health perspective, but there is an economic mess out there waiting to happen, where thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people are worried to death and sick about whether they can pay their rent, whether they essentially can afford their mortgage, whether they're going to keep their jobs, and whether they can essentially live from week to week for the next few months. And I sense that Rishi Sunak, to be fair, in his initial address covered some of that, but he's going to go a lot further in the next 24, 48 hours. And I think the Premier League have got to do the same in respect of football clubs, because essentially we cannot see football clubs going to the wall because of this virus.
Jamie, Gary said that there were events in the past that we could learn from and perhaps use some of the things that we've learned from that in order to formulate a plan going forward. But given the circumstances under which the Premier League are working, given that this is an unprecedented set of circumstances, what do you think about the job that they're doing, the statement they put out, and the way that they're trying to plan for the future?
Well, I was really impressed with the Premier League today, because I think, you know, Gary's mentioned about the economic side, there's obviously the health situation, but the Premier League are also looking at the football side of it also. And I think what they did in terms of saying the league will, basically I think they said today the league will finish at some stage. I think that's been the biggest question from a football point of view, really. There's lots of intricacies within that, but I think it almost gave closure to the questions of different people, and maybe people looking after themselves, about teams going up, going down, Champions League places, maybe even Liverpool for the title. I think that has been the question sort of swirling around football, really, and that almost puts that question to an end now, and it's just whether the Premier League with UEFA, how it affects next season. But actually it just feels to me, when that statement came out from the Premier League today, I thought that was great leadership, and just sort of sending a message to everyone, this is what's happening, now we've got to find a way to make it work. And I think it puts a lot of questions to bed in some ways, and now we can start asking different ones about how do we actually get where we need to get to, and the timescale of this season finishing, and also how it affects next season.
It's worth remembering, I suppose, as well, that there isn't actually any government advice about what football should be doing in this circumstance. The football world is working on their own information and to some degree on the broader government guidelines and recommendations.
I think you're absolutely right, Kelly, and that's why I was critical 10 days ago about the Premier League, because the idea that they were willing to put 1 million people into football stadiums over a Premier League weekend and thinking they could just wing it and get away with it, to me was reckless. I felt as though when the Mikel Arteta situation was announced on that Thursday evening, and they essentially ended up with reactive leadership, they were made to look a little bit foolish, in my opinion.
But were they not? That come from the government, though, isn't that the biggest problem? That actually the government, they're getting led from the government, and the leadership coming from the government is not right. What did you actually want the Premier League to do there in that situation?
We've just seen the guy who represents the government speaking, and to be fair, I think if football is going to take their steer from him, then I think ultimately I've got no faith in football.
How can they not? Every other country in this situation took their decision from their government. Jamie, the Premier League couldn't have done anything different, I don't think.
I accept it's unprecedented times, and I accept the difficulties of this, but what I would expect is decisive leadership that puts health of supporters, football players and their staff first. it was plainly obvious as the situation was developing that week, and I started tweeting out around Monday, Tuesday, saying, what are you going to do, Premier League, EFL? Because I could sense that this was brewing into a situation that was going to come back and hit them hard. You've got to remember, there was a government 2 weeks ago, Boris Johnson publicly was essentially jovially bragging about shaking everybody's hand who had the coronavirus in hospitals. 4 or 5 days later, he was talking to us about herd immunity strategy and the fact that that was the right way to go. And 3 or 4 days later, he was then talking about an isolation strategy. So I think if you're football and you're looking at the guidance of the guy that we've just seen speaking there, you've got to read between the lines and think, well, OK, the American League had shut down, the Italian League had shut down, the Spanish League had shut down. Hang on.
On the recommendation from the government.
On a contingency basis, you're the Premier League and you sit down on a Thursday morning. What happens if one of our managers, one of our players, one of our fans in the stadium or something happens over the weekend? What will that do to the Premier League? What example would it set? So essentially, I feel there was enough intelligence of national leagues, of other things that were happening that should have, in my opinion, led to the Premier League making a really decisive decision, taking the lead, ignoring essentially what was a government that was all over the place at that time.
It's difficult to ignore the government. Put yourself in the Premier League's position. Well, you've got someone in there, Richard Masters, who's just come in. It's been there for 20 years with Richard Scudamore. Nothing like this has ever happened before. You've said yourself, it's unprecedented. And you're asking them to go against the government. The leagues you're talking about, the Spanish League, the Italian League, that was a recommendation from the government.
I think, firstly, what I would say is that the clubs have the power in the Premier League, so I wouldn't put it down to an individual. Secondly, what I would say is in moments of crisis, the real leaders stand up and make tough decisions, which sometimes go against the grain of essentially what's happening. The government at that time, through Boris Johnson, were essentially zigzagging all over the place with their messages. Even today, he's talked about, let's protect each other. I watched his address earlier on at 5 o'clock, and he talked about essentially self-isolating, protect each other, be resilient on this. But he's not shut clubs, bars, restaurants, pubs. Schools aren't closing till tomorrow evening. The messages are so conflicting from government and, to be fair, economically driven at times, I have to say. And I felt the Premier League saying that the games would continue for another weekend was almost winging it to try and get another round in. But, however, I understand the complexities of it, but I do feel that decisive leadership's important.
Gary, we should point out that the comments about herd immunity were made by Patrick Vallance rather than by the Prime Minister, and he's one of the scientific advisors. The government are working with a strong scientific team and with the information that's available to them, and I'm sure that if they were approached to respond to your comments, that's what they would point, that they're working with the science.
Yeah, I mean, I think every time I see the Chief Medical Officer stood next to Boris Johnson, I see he looks more and more uncomfortable. He did explain his strategy with the Prime Minister present, and then was challenged by 200 other scientists over the weekend, and essentially Matt Hancock on a Sunday programme, I think it was. It might have even been a Sunday newspaper behind the paywall initially, I think, actually suggested that they weren't going to pursue that strategy. So again, ultimately, I'm not a scientist, but you have to have consistency of messaging and decisive leadership. I do feel actually now this week the government have got decisive leadership. I do feel there is consistent messaging. I understand the predicament the Premier League were in, but if they couldn't smell the danger, and we know that from obviously the press leaks as well, certain clubs were very uncomfortable about playing that weekend. If they couldn't smell the danger of basically what the impact it would have on the Premier League globally if something happened on their watch, I just think it needed to be a bit more decisive earlier.
I think it was difficult for them. There was a Champions League game I was at on the Wednesday night between Liverpool and Atletico Madrid. There was actually a case involving Wolves and Olympiacos, where I think the Olympiacos owner contracted the virus, and still that wasn't abandoned. So I think that puts the Premier League in a really difficult decision. You're talking about leadership coming from Boris Johnson, and the Premier League should just take their own lead. And that Boris Johnson hasn't closed pubs, he hasn't closed hotels, restaurants, different things. Well, what about leadership? Did you close your restaurant last week or 2 weeks ago on the back? When you see it, you're talking about making your own decision and doing that, not listening to Boris Johnson.
We have closed. We are closing our hotels and restaurants.
Is that now down to getting a message from someone else up above? Because that's what you're criticising the Premier League for not doing that.
No, we essentially we are closing, and the fact of the matter is that essentially you make decisions that we weren't putting 1 million people in stadiums over a weekend with the Premier League brand. And that is ultimately what the Premier League were doing that weekend. I accept that we as a hotels, as you know, Salford City haven't trained for a week, and to be fair, we'd written a letter to the we'd agreed this morning they weren't going to train next week before.
Could you have stopped Salford's game that weekend without the EFL or well, certainly the EFL saying you're allowed to? Could you not have just said, OK, we're not playing?
I'm bound by confidentiality in some ways, but I did write to the EFL urging them to cancel football fixtures that weekend before they made the decision. So essentially, you know, and I was also, to be fair, publicly on Twitter 2-3 days before the Premier League said they were going to continue, saying I thought that the Premier League and EFL needed to act. So I don't think you know, it's not after the Lord Mayor's show this or after the sort of event. I just feel that the Premier League has to be the highest sort of standard of flag bearing, of decision making in this country. I have more faith in the Premier League and football, because I know football generally is full of good people that have people at heart. I generally believe that because I've been in it for such a long time. With government, there are economic decisions that essentially they've got a lot to consider. I accept you can't just say close this, close that. I accept these things are difficult decisions, but you want consistency and decisive leadership in these moments. I do believe now, to be fair, government and the Premier League, more importantly, which is I'm more interested in, are making very decisive decisions. They're making the right calls. They're telling everybody early. They're cancelling games early. They're keeping players away from training grounds early. So I feel more comforted now that essentially they're being more definite and putting health first rather than economic reason first.
We will talk a little bit more about that question of leadership and where the leadership should come from in football. There seems to be a lot of discussion amongst the various bodies, but who should be the one who's leading that? In terms of as Gary said, Bryan, the Premier League making the decision to stop playing Premier League football, to put a pause in this season, it did come, so it's worth remembering that it did come in a period of real uncertainty and very, very fast-moving change.
I think in times of uncertainty, what people always say, to pick up on Gary and Jamie's points there, is they want consistency, they want clarity, they want communication, they want collaboration. It was a very confusing picture around European football last week. We had, to Jamie's point, we had Liverpool playing at Anfield, we had Rangers playing in front of fans at Ibrox, we then had Paris Saint-Germain playing behind closed doors, but then there were a couple of hundred, if not thousand, supporters outside defying the order to stay at home. And what the Premier League always made the point to us last week was that the decision ultimately to suspend the games was because it was having a direct impact on some of the team's abilities to fulfil their fixtures. If you think Arsenal, in terms of Mikel Arteta's positive test, that was the game changer as far as the Premier League were concerned. We then saw Callum Hudson-Odoi at Chelsea, and there were clubs phoning them up saying, we are really worried about fulfilling our fixtures. They will always go back to that government advice at the time, and they will say that the scientific evidence was saying to the government that there wasn't a major risk at that time. It was about the stress and strain on the emergency services. But then to add to the confusion, let's not forget we had tens of thousands of people at Cheltenham. And that was still ongoing at a time when ultimately then the Premier League decided collectively that they had to suspend their competition.
We will return to the question of leadership very shortly, and we'll also be looking at some of the key dates and some of the key decisions that have to be made. You're watching The Debate, and Jamie Carragher and Gary Neville are in Manchester. They're our guests this evening as we reflect on the effect of coronavirus on football. We were talking about the leadership in the Premier League and across football, across the FA, across the EFL and further afield. Jamie, should there be one clear voice, one clear person, one clear organisation leading this and giving one simple, clear message?
Well, you'd like it to be like that, but we've argued for a long time before this crisis happened that you've got the FA, the Premier League and now the EFL, and should there be one voice throughout football? That was easy before the Premier League came about in the early 90s. It was just the FA were there. So now there's so many different people. When something like this happens, who can lead? For me, it has to be the Premier League if anyone's going to lead. I don't think the FA really has much power now within our game, or certainly nowhere near as much as it used to. I think the Premier League, as Gary's mentioned before, is that sort of governing body and seen around the world as, I don't like to use the word, but certainly great brand, and how the Premier League has come about, really, but certainly with the huge help of Richard Scudamore as well. But in the EFL, they've got someone I know really well in Rick Parry, who has actually been at the top end of the Premier League when it first started. Now top man at the EFL, but also being involved in one of the top clubs in the country in Liverpool. So I think there's great leadership coming from there. We obviously know there's been a turnaround at the Premier League. It was the same man involved for 20 years. Now there's been a turnaround. It looked at one stage that no one quite wanted the job at different stages through that process. But I think the Premier League has to lead, but you have to accept there are three different bodies within our league, and at times that brings its own problems, and now might be one of those times.
Just explain to me why you're sort of saying that the FA aren't to be the driving force in this. They've been over-representing, or they've been representing English football interests on the conference call with UEFA as far as what happens with Euro 2020 this week. So that the FA are the voice for English football in some cases and not in others. What's their role in all of this then?
Well, I think the Premier League, as I've just said before, they are the main thing of what English football has become. Yes, beforehand you had, the First Division going down to Division 4. Of course, the FA were running that. Then the Premier League breaks away and it becomes what it is now, which is it's amazing. It's spoken about throughout the world. So they have huge power. The Premier League clubs have huge money. The facilities of Premier League club stadiums, training facilities, come through the fact of, obviously, ourselves at Sky, broadcasting deals now. It's a phenomenon what the Premier League has become. So there's no doubt, because it's so successful and so big and so powerful, it has to be that huge influence within our game. But there are different parts to it, as I've just mentioned before. But Gary, you've mentioned, obviously, your role now with Salford and dealing with the AFL more than the Premier League. Is there a problem there with leadership? I've just mentioned Rick Parry, someone I know.
I think ultimately, until the Premier League shout, the rest of the organisations, LMA, PFA, EFL, National League, are going to basically be subservient to them, because essentially they're funded by the Premier League and they fund football. So you're not going to go against essentially your paymasters. So from that point of view, I would say the Premier League have the voice, they have the power. It would be great to have a situation of harmony within football where everybody's interests are best represented all at once, but unless the Premier League in some ways act first, the rest of football isn't going to go against them. And I look at the Premier League at the moment, like I said before, I think they've got a huge opportunity in these next few weeks to put something together.
Are we going to Bryan?
They've done that initially in regards to health, economy of football needs to be looked after, and employees need to be looked after. And I'm not just talking about playing staff, non-playing staff. And then I think looking outside of football and what they can do to support communities and the health service and other things in this time. So football has to be seen to do more than just support football.
Was it possible in this situation now to have sort of one voice in football? Could that have worked?
No, it's not going to happen anymore. It's not going to happen, like you said once, obviously. The FA are the governing body of football in name, but in reality it's the FA that are the Premier League that call the shots in 99% of the situations. And from an EFL point of view, the money that flows down from the Premier League into the EFL is enormous. And at this moment in time, there'll be some very, very worried EFL clubs that will want financial packages, they'll want revenue loss coverage, they'll be concerned about where the next pound is coming from. And these aren't just clubs that have been run badly, by the way, that essentially have overspent. It's clubs that have been run really well, but just haven't got the contingency pot in place to be able to consume what would be the loss that's going to happen in these next few weeks and months. We don't know when it's going to be. I mean, one of the things that's come out today is that the Premier League and EFL have said that they want to finish the season. I said a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, the idea of playing behind closed doors was a non-starter really for EFL clubs, because the loss of revenue of those matches would be a real problem. I spoke to a National League chairman over this last couple of days whereby they're going to need rescue packages because they can't afford to pay staff and players and they'll go under. The Premier League will know this and they have to make the call on it. And that's where I say they've got to look after the health first, football second, and then they've got to look beyond that to really finish the job off to the wider communities and ensure that everybody's assisted, because it can play a big part in terms of setting the tone for how we behave in this time.
On to a more in-depth discussion about the economics and the economic impact of this on football, and particularly those harsh impacts that it's going to have further down the football pyramid. At the top, though, when we're talking about leadership, Bryan, what's the relationship between the FA and the Premier League?
Well, we have spoken for some time about the relationship and the dynamic. It's worth remembering that the Football Association holds a special share in the Premier League. The FA chairman, Greg Clark, attends their key club meetings every year. He dials into their conference call. He was on last week's emergency call. He couldn't make it today, I don't think, because of the FA board meeting. There hasn't always been the easiest of relationships between the Premier League and the FA, thinking back particularly under the Lord Treesman era at the Football Association. But when you look now at Greg Clark, he is now a FIFA vice president. He's got a seat at the top table. And I think the feeling within the game now is that they have never been as close. And what's been fascinating to see in this crisis is the speed at which they have all issued their joint statements. Working in the kind of football politics world for some time, that is not easy, and that within the game does demonstrate some hope and some optimism for the future that they can collectively reach an agreement when they really, really need to.
Coming up, we will take a look at some of the key decisions, the key dates that have to be looked at to get this Premier League season to an end, and some of the dates further down the league in terms of playoffs and in terms of championship promotion and relegation. We'll talk about those issues next. Welcome back to the debate. Jamie Carragher and Gary Neville are in Manchester. Bryan Swanson alongside me here in the studio. As we mentioned, we're going to talk about some of the key dates that are coming up. There are lots of them, but the bare bones, what are we looking at?
So after today, April the 30th, that's the new revised date to resume English football. That date was selected to try to help clubs, to give them some degree of planning in the next couple of weeks, to try and plan training schedules, etc., to possibly give them some time off. The big key date is June the 30th. That's when the contracts usually cut off. That is the preferred date in European football for the European leagues, the competitions to finish by. And then, of course, there's August the 8th, the scheduled start of the Premier League season. What could be a game changer here is FIFA. They have a working group to discuss player contracts and registrations. A lot of people in the game are looking to them to find out if they change or relax those regulations. That then potentially has an impact. One official said to me over the last couple of days, why are you all rushing to start the season in August? The priority has to be to end the current season. But ultimately, Kelly, the Premier League knows that if they are going to try to change beyond that June the 30th, it has to be in line with the rest of European football. You can't have the Premier League doing one thing, Serie A, La Liga, because that raises a whole host of issues off the back.
And when we were talking earlier about the statement that was made earlier today, it did seem that that was very much the intention, that the season would be finished, with obvious caveats, of course, depending on how this virus progresses. Do you think, Gary, the Premier League season specifically, has to be finished?
I think that would be the mindset of every single football fan, every single football individual player or coach, that you would have to finish this current season for integrity. However, at this moment in time, we are in a situation that's so challenging that it doesn't even feel like it's the most important thing in terms of discussing. What I do feel is, though, that the obviously moment that football can be played again, I don't think you'll have any barriers from players, from clubs, from fans about cramming more games into a shorter period of time, essentially to do the right thing by this season, but obviously by the future seasons and the future cup competitions and tournaments that are going to exist. So I think you'll have an open door from the LMA, PFA, EFL, National League. Every single league around Europe will be an open door, in essence, in terms of fitting in. And I think I do have great faith in the football authorities to be able to put a calendar together that may be more challenging than previous seasons, but then that's just, you know, the way it's going to be. And I think that will happen unless this goes on for a very long time and essentially becomes a problem that is just beyond any of us, or certainly the Prime Minister's thinking, because he's mentioned, you know, the 12-week time frame earlier on today.
Jamie,
no,
what do you...
I don't think the dates that we've... I'm sorry, Kelly. I don't think the dates that we've been given this June the 30th, that is UEFA hoping and praying, because if football's finished then, that means that next season just carries on as normal, really. It's just a few weeks later. There's no way the Champions League final will be at the end of June. It's actually impossible, really. Man City in our division is still in the Champions League and the FA Cup. I think they'd have to start playing football in the middle of April and play every midweek if they were to play in a Champions League final. So I don't see us playing football back, because the Premier League have just said 30th of April. So I'm not sure where these games can be crammed in, really. The league, this season has to finish, because I think if you think of teams and players and also supporters, they've invested so much emotionally, financially in this season that it has to have a conclusion whenever that may be. It's next season I feel the authorities have to be creative with, and I hope UEFA right now are actually thinking of things for next season, because I think privately they've just given a date and it's almost like, OK, we'll align in the sand June the 30th. I think they know that is not happening. They've got to be thinking of next season and the Nations League. How important is the Nations League to them? Is it possible to actually push Champions League games back further if in the Premier League we take out maybe cup competitions or replays? Other European nations also only have one cup competition. Another point Bryan made was that all the leagues have to be in sync. Well, we're talking about we've only got 9 games left in the Premier League. Serie A's got 14. Inter Milan are still in the Europa League, I think. They could have a maximum of 20 games to play. So this idea of finishing the Europa League and the Champions League at the end, it's not happening. So something has got to give with next season. But as I said at the start, I think the effect of what's happened has to affect next season. And the reason being is because it still makes everything equal. No matter what happens next season, what changes happen or come in, games taken out, everyone starts on the same page. There's too much difference within the league this season. People talk about Liverpool getting the title. Liverpool's the easy thing. I actually look at Champions League places or relegation, teams coming up, and I just don't see how that can be solved without finishing, because there's just so much financial implications involved.
Yeah, I think that health will come first, and obviously making sure that the health services are not stretched for sporting occasions, and obviously that people's safety is paramount. But you're absolutely right, there will come an economic squeeze at some point where, if we believe the reports, there's £750 million owed to the Premier League for what will be broadcasting rights globally, and that will start to pinch. Those commitments from clubs have been made. The commitments not only from Premier League clubs but from clubs down the leagues to fulfil contracts with players. Something's going to have to give at some point. And I made a statement a couple of weeks ago that I was against behind closed doors football for revenue loss for EFL clubs, because essentially it would cause them a big problem. I wonder whether the Premier League may somehow, in some way, get behind closed doors football through for themselves. I don't know how it would happen in terms of not stretching the health services, but it certainly wouldn't be for the next few weeks. But maybe in a period of time of, say, 2 to 3 weeks, where they squeeze the whole season into it to get that £750 million in, it gives, obviously, the Premier League clubs some of the income that they need to be able to, obviously, prop up their football clubs for the contracts that they've promised, but washes down also into the EFL clubs, the National League clubs, and potentially outwards towards other projects that require it in the country. So I think that at some point there will become an economic squeeze, a legal squeeze around players' contracts, broadcasting contracts and other such things, that will mean the Premier League may need to find a way to get this season finished quicker than we think.
You're an owner, or certainly highly involved at Salford. You're not involved in, obviously, Premier League meetings, but if you were in those meetings and we're not privy to exactly what's happened, certain clubs and people involved in clubs have come out and given their opinion in the press, whether the league should continue, whether it should be null and void. If you were in those meetings, if Salford were in the Premier League, or this meeting was happening with the EFL, would you almost be fighting your club's corner, or be thinking, what is the greater good for the division?
I think that the Premier League will be remembered at this moment in time, as will club owners, for doing the right thing by essentially health first and foremost of fans, of players and the staff. Secondly, protecting all of football from economic ruin. And I say this third point of making sure that they look after communities and, as much as possible, people that need it in the surrounding areas through this, ridiculously serious time that we live in. So from that point of view, owners will be looked at beyond the decisions that they make for their own individual clubs. You have to look after your own individual club, of course you do, in your own individual business, and make sure your employees and your staff are protected, but you have to look beyond that when making a decision as part of the Premier League. And essentially we know that the 13 club rule exists, but they've got to cut through that and get to the right decision morally, for the right decisions for everybody, not just for their own clubs.
We will return to that question of economics, because it's a subject that we need to go into in some detail, of course. But while we're sort of focusing on what happens between now and the end of this season, the contract issue from the 30th of June, that's going to be hugely complex, both from the players' point of view in terms of where they want to be playing at the turn of the summer, and from a club's point of view, as which club is the player going to belong to?
There is no doubt, and I don't think it's the priority of anybody's thoughts at this moment in time, but there will be some very worried football players. But you talk about the June 30th date, Kelly, from a point of view of contracts that are professional contracts for the Football League and for the Premier League. But the contracts for the National League clubs that run out at the end of April, early May, we've got players at Salford, and so will many other League Two and League One clubs have players on loan at National League clubs who only account to pay players till the end of April and early May. They are in significant trouble if they don't get some type of revenue cover or some type of football insurance cover that will be covered by the Premier League in these next few months. And that's why I'm saying I think it's not just about the June 30th date for Premier League clubs and the EFL clubs, because I think that they will look at those, and I'm sure are assessing with intrinsic accountancy at this moment in time exactly what they need to survive. But there is also the lower leagues beyond the EFL to look at. We very fortunately got promoted out of non-league football last year as Salford into the Football League, and in essence, left non-league football behind. But it would be absolutely stupid of me not to sit here and talk about the end of April, early May contracts that exist in non-league football, which will become a real pressure for players, a real pressure for clubs. They cannot afford, National League clubs, National League North and South clubs, today cannot afford to pay players their wages and staff their wages. We've seen what Barnet have done in the last 48, 72 hours, which is making 60 people redundant. And we've got to make sure that football clubs don't go to the wall below the Football League. And contracts are an issue at the top of the game, but they're also an issue at the bottom of the game. And a support package for football is going to need to be put in place here. There's a support package for the nation being put in place by the Chancellor to protect all jobs, to protect all people's incomes, to create revenue deferrals for rent and mortgages and other things that create a great pressure and worry for people. But there's got to be one in football for football clubs, because football clubs are a huge asset in the community. They bring hope and joy every single weekend, and they've got to make sure that at the very top of the game that we come out of this crisis with the game protected right the way through to the bottom.
And that, of course, that's the most important thing, the health and then the security of people who work in the game, not all of whom, and very few of whom actually, are those top-earning Premier League players. It's about protecting people all the way through. Just to return to this issue of wrapping up this season, Jamie, you and Gary both are talking about having to, in an ideal circumstance, get this season finished across the board. And you said you think that Liverpool actually here is the easy decision to make because they're so far clear at the top of the Premier League. But because there has been that 30-year wait, do you think, or do you feel slightly uncomfortable about talking about the need to get this Premier League season finished with your Liverpool connections?
Uncomfortable. He's been retweeting everybody over. He's been retweeting everybody over the last week that says the league must be finished.
And he was doing the opposite. That kicked me off. Do I feel uncomfortable? No, I don't feel uncomfortable. I think we first answered at the top of the show, and we caveat everything we say on this show by saying nothing is more important than the health and the coronavirus. I'm beating that. But I also don't think we should hide away from the fact that how much football means to us and how important it is in people's lives and everyone's lives. And not just Liverpool supporters now, right up and down the country. And for me, football starts when basically the Premier League or the government feel as if this virus is under control and we can get back to playing football. It doesn't bother me when that is. In some ways, it's just about when football starts, I just feel so much is being put into this season by so many people up and down the country. I don't know how you can stop it. You talk about Champions League places, Man City's situation, Sheffield United, I think, are just behind Man United. If they win the game in hand, they go above them. Does that mean they take the place? Aston Villa have got a game in hand to get out the bottom three. There was talk of the top two in the Championship going into the Premier League, and then everyone's happy. There's no relegations anywhere through the divisions. But how would Fulham feel? They're only 5 or 6 points behind, I think, Leeds and West Brom. Leeds blew it last year when they were in the same position. So there's so many questions, really, around sort of if you stop the league now and we all take our positions. And I just think the Premier League or the FA, whoever it may be, there'll be owners getting involved, people will be getting sued left, right and centre. I heard the Hearts owner, I think, a few days ago saying exactly the same. I think the Hair Club were bottom of the SPL at that time as well. And I just think it's going to be an absolute mess, really, throughout the league. And when I say Liverpool's the easy bit in some ways, I'm not saying Liverpool should be given the lead, because for me, if the league doesn't carry on, it doesn't feel right. Something's not quite right about that. Yes, we all know Liverpool were or are going to go on and win the league. They need to win, I think, probably 1 or 2 games. But if a league stops, it just doesn't feel right. Yes, Liverpool may be given the league, that's what people are saying, but there'll always be something there that just didn't feel quite right about it. But that's not going to affect Liverpool economically or what division they're in, or maybe affect them for a few years. Teams going out the Premier League really struggle to get back into the Premier League. So that could affect the team for 4 or 5 years. If Leeds don't get up this season, that could stop them for the next 4 or 5 years. Maybe they lose the manager, who knows? There's so much. That's why I say Liverpool isn't the most important thing. It's the actual teams who are going to lose huge sums of money and completely in different divisions. And also, how do you affect next season's Champions League? So this season has to finish because it impacts next season because of European places and Champions League places. How do you decide the top 4 now and who's in Europe next season? So I think whenever the date is when we get back to playing football, even if it was August, September, for me, it doesn't... I want it to happen as quickly as possible, and obviously with everything going on, with that in mind. But also, whenever it does, this needs to be finished. And for me, you have to be creative with next season. And I go back to a decision a few years ago where the World Cup was given to Qatar, and out of nowhere, it just gets plonked in the middle of the season, and we have to work around that and find a way to do it. And it was done. So I think eventually they'll have to find a way to make it work.
He's a little bit touchy on this one, Kelly, over the last few days on our messages. I say give Liverpool the league, and I keep sending the little asterisk sign so that you just have that little note next to it. Liverpool won the league, but I mean, it would be an absolute, I think, doomsday scenario for football. I mean, at the end of the day, football doesn't matter at this moment in time, but it would have to be a doomsday scenario for football not to finish the existing fixtures for this season, because I don't see how you essentially could shift on with next season without just essentially finishing those fixtures. So for me, there isn't anybody that's in a position of power. I think there was one person maybe who reversed back down the road, obviously, once they'd realised they'd made a mistake. But I think there isn't anybody in a position of power who isn't saying at this moment in time the intention should be to finish the season when football resumes. I think at this moment in time, though, I think the most important thing is making sure that they make decisive decisions around extending the season, the protection of staff, players and guests and fans, and they've done that. So they've bought themselves some time, I think, the Premier League and the EFL clubs to be, or the EFL to be able to react over this next few weeks. The last thing that I'm actually worried about at this moment in time is sorting out the fixtures. If football players need to play every day for 9 days to finish the Premier League as a worst case scenario, they would do it because they'd just get their heads round it and they would make it a festival of football, and it would be something quite spectacular. And football can really bring some hope and joy when the country finally comes out of this crisis. And doing a festival of football for 2 weeks, where the league's finished in 2 weeks, the Champions League's finished in a week, the FA Cup is finished in 4 days, could be something quite special. I'm not saying they're the examples that should be followed, but you understand what I'm saying here, that there could be something quite spectacular. Football fans coming together after this crisis is over could really bring some joy back to the nation, because it does impact so many people in so many towns and cities across the country.
We will talk about some of those possible ways that football can be a force for positive later on in the programme. You can get your tweets into the boys as well, at Sky Sports News, using the hashtag #TheDebate, and we'll be answering some of those a little bit later on. Up next, though, we've touched on this a bit throughout the course of the programme, but we're going to drill down into the economics and the business impact of the coronavirus on football. Hello and welcome back to The Debate, where we're reflecting on the impact of coronavirus on football, as important as that is at a time like this. Bryan Swanson is here in the studio. Jamie Carragher and Gary Neville are in Manchester. Bryan, we've heard what the Premier League, the EFL, the English leagues have had to say, and now the Scottish Premiership has made a statement as well.
Yeah, while we've just been on air, Kelly, there has been a joint response issued from the SFA and the SPFL, and it says that they want to reiterate that football in Scotland remains suspended indefinitely. They say that it will not resume before the 30th of April. The medical advice is that we will not have reached the peak in this country of coronavirus by then, the 30th of April. They say it is still their firm intention to begin next season, as is practically possible later this year. So very much falling in line with what we've seen here in England earlier today with that 30th of April date. But their statement there pointing out about the medical evidence saying that it will not have reached the peak in this country by then.
While we're talking about the Scottish Premiership, Hearts have asked their playing staff and non-playing staff to take a 50% pay cut. Gary, is this in line with your recommendation that clubs should look after the people that work for them, or is this a more long-term plan that allows the club to continue to exist? Where is that line drawn here?
Kelly, there is a massive health crisis out there, but there's an economic bloodbath waiting to happen if the government and Chancellor and Boris Johnson and others don't put these these support packages in place very quickly. Now, I think they are doing, but obviously they've been caught out by this as well, but they do have recent recessions and obviously the 9/11 tragedy to be able to call upon where there were economic events of a serious nature. It is unsurprising to me, Kelly, that clubs or businesses will be looking at their staff with a more social approach. There's two ways of looking at it. If you haven't got the money to pay people, you either look at it as you're going to make a lot of people redundant or a percentage of your staff redundant, or you ask all your staff to muck in together and take a social approach whereby they take a 50% pay cut or a 30% pay cut or a 20% pay cut. That is a more fair way of doing it. What you would hope is, and you know, I personally have been locked in rooms for the last week looking at obviously the individual businesses that I have, and what you're looking at is hopefully rent holidays, mortgage holidays given to all affected industries and individuals to take some pressure off businesses so that they can then keep them employed. We have to make sure, as people who are in, you know, when you set up a business, you take a responsibility to look after the people that you employ, and you have to look after those people well, because essentially they're your lifeblood. So from that point of view, you know, what Hearts have done today, we saw that earlier on this week, I think Richard Branson asked his 75% of his workforce to take 8 weeks unpaid leave. That is a very, very serious situation for that 75% of workforce and what it will do to them. So from that point of view, 50% reduction in pay is something that will become the norm until potentially the government announce packages of support that give people comfort, that give businesses comfort and give employees comfort. And that needs to unfold quite quickly, and the details aren't there yet. You know, the high-level announcements have been made, but the details of how you access that money for businesses has not yet been made clear, I think, until next week. And certainly the positions for people who are, you know, tenants who rent properties, they're in a precarious position. They've got situations which they need to look at. It is a nightmare, this, and it's something that's completely unexpected. It goes beyond normal business contingency funds, and it isn't surprising that Hearts are in that position. There'll be clubs all over this country, if they don't get revenue quickly or support quickly, will have to make those types of tough decisions and may even go to the wall. So there needs to be something put in place very quickly.
There's been lots of discussion about the insurance issues in the hospitality industry. Football, I would imagine, would be similarly along those lines. What's the insurance situation like in football? Is there insurance across the board for this kind of situation?
In football, I'm not sure. You know, I've looked at obviously the finances of Salford this week, just in particular from our point of view, and you know, we will be disrupted, but to a point whereby, you know, we fortunately for ourselves can support ourselves. In terms of other clubs, I've got deep sympathy and would expect that they would need support quite quickly. In the hospitality industry, it is horrific. It's the third biggest industry in this country, and at this moment in time, the population are being told not to go into pubs, bars, restaurants, hotels, nightclubs, theatres, yet they're not telling these premises to shut. The government know exactly what they're doing in respect of protecting insurance companies. They know that if they say certain things and do certain things, it will create clauses, it will trigger clauses that will essentially mean massive insurance payments, which again could cause problems for the economy. So I'm not shouting here from a point of view that there aren't knock-on implications if insurance could be claimed, but there is a very precarious position in the hospitality industry, but in football, but in all other industries as well. And at this moment in time, the only people who can print the money that will stave off a massive economic crisis here that will affect people up and down the country are the government and everybody. Every time I switch on the the Prime Minister's address and the Chancellor's addresses every single night at the moment, hoping and praying for economic stimulants that will enable everybody in this country to keep income, to protect themselves, to keep themselves healthy and safe, for their families to be healthy and safe, but also that they can live off each week through this crisis, because that is the most important thing.
It's not entirely clear at the moment that even if the government were to close bars, restaurants, nightclubs, that they would even then be necessarily insured. That's just not clear at the moment. But when we're talking about asking people to take...
Sorry, Kelly, I know what are in the insurance clauses of my particular businesses, and I know at the moment the government are staying away from using the phrases and the sanctions that would essentially trigger those clauses. I can only speak for my own insurance clauses within my own hospitality businesses.
I'm just being the voice when they don't have a voice to represent, because they're not here to ask the question to. So we need to put the other side of the argument on that. But we are talking about people being asked to take pay cuts at this time. I mean, these are people who will be asked to do that in order to either keep their jobs or in order to either help the club to continue to keep running, so to keep their employers going, if you like. Is there a case, Jamie, do you think, for asking people or for players to volunteer to take a pay cut in order to support the people who are less well paid at a football club?
Well, I think a lot of players now, you obviously big social media following, they can put things out, they can take those decisions themselves. I think a lot of players, I think me and Gary are similar, but certainly the players of today will have foundations and charities as well that they put money into, and they will give out maybe at times to their local area. So you're thinking, I think Gary mentioned before about Marcus Rashford, maybe mentioned something in the last few hours on social media about what he's trying to do and trying to help. I certainly think people will be looking to help where they're from and their city and their areas. Gary's doing that with some of the things he's doing with the hotel and helping people there. I'm doing something similar next week with my foundation. But of course, I think people always look to footballers because there is a vast sum of money that they get, and we were very lucky as well when we were playing. We were in the same position. Really. And I think at times we forget, a lot of footballers now, they do a lot of good within the communities and where they come from. I don't think you can bring in a sanction where they come from, because we know it's a working class sport. Probably 90% of footballers who come through and play at every level have come from that working class background. So you'd like to think they will give something back. Now, as I said, I don't think you can say a certain amount. I think it's up to the goodness of certain players, and everyone's different. And I'm sure foreign players, because this crisis at the moment is affecting everyone within the world, so maybe they give something back to the place where they come from also. But I think there's footballers out there, and I think they'll all be looking at this situation and thinking what they can do.
Yeah, I think it has to come from within. I agree with Jamie. I think putting a sanction on players to say you must give up 50% of your wage is something that I don't think will happen. But I think that footballers, in my opinion and my experience, are incredibly generous people and from the types of backgrounds that would essentially look at their communities first and think, right, I've got to look after you. And I think that it will come from within. I think it would be helpful if the PFA, as a organisation who represent all players, could come up with some type of solidarity position within football, because not all leagues are the same. If I looked at, say, the National League or League Two, You know, there are players on, you know, a few £100. They're not on £200,000 a week. And I think it's important to mention that every football player across all the leagues are in different economic positions. But there potentially could be some way in which football players could look at some type of solidarity position to assist employees within their football clubs in non-playing staff positions. I think it'll be already happening. I really do. I think that, you know, what we've seen at Hearts earlier on in terms of the 50% pay cut for playing staff and non-playing staff, I think you will see. I think Borussia Mönchengladbach's players offered their wages up to pay for non-playing staff earlier on today. I think you will see great gestures made in the coming days when football players have worked out what it is they can support and how they can help their fellow colleagues in non-playing positions, but also the community and people that they can support in and around them.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that the situation at Hearts is that they've been offered employment in another football club that was able to provide them with some financial security in terms of that. Gary, you said earlier about the playing behind closed doors, that you changed your mind on Premier League clubs playing behind closed doors, that you think that actually that could be a way to get the Premier League season finished in a safe way, much in Scotland and England, in Wales. Would that be a financial issue for them? Could that cost them money, and could it cost them a significant amount of money?
Yeah, I think if the Premier League were able to deliver it safely, behind closed doors football, bring in the revenue that's obviously would be brought in from gate revenue and broadcasting revenue, and wash that down towards the clubs that require it for financial rescue, I think that would be something that the EFL would look at. It will cause huge problems for some EFL clubs and National League clubs to not have the revenue from the remaining fixtures and other revenue streams that obviously would exist with playing football this season. That I know that already, having spoken to directors and chairmen of other clubs that I'm close to. So I think I'm sure the Premier League. I'm comforted by the Premier League statement today. I'm sure the Premier League and the EFL are now looking at what would be the impact of supporting football generally so that we don't lose clubs through this crisis. And one of those options will be looking at percentage reductions in wages for players, I'm sure. But cutting people's income, no matter who it is, has got to be a last resort. It has to be first and foremost that they can get the income that they are due from the football matches if they can. It's how they can deliver behind closed doors football safely. There are such... Take Liverpool as an example. You know, behind closed doors, Liverpool are playing to win the league. How many Liverpool fans are going to turn up for that match outside the stadium? It's a monumental occasion for Liverpool fans, you know, winning it for the first time in 30 years. But then you look at, well, OK, could you put police cordons in place to stop the fans coming? But then you're talking about demanding the emergency services and other such things. It's just an absolute nightmare from a logistical point of view to think how behind closed doors football could be delivered safely at this moment in time, with the emergency services all required for obviously the population, not for football. So if it could be delivered safely at a point in time, then that would be good. But again, at this moment in time, I don't think it's something that would even be on the table.
Gary, how much actually goes on at football clubs on non-match days? Is it costing clubs a significant amount of money just to keep functioning without football?
Yeah, there are hold costs, obviously, mainly I think in salaries. There are running costs, but mainly salaries are the biggest thing. I think it's salaries and hold costs. Potentially, you just don't know how strong each individual club's sponsorship contracts are, commercial contracts. If they don't finish seasons, or if they don't have a certain amount of matches. You talk about match day hospitality, you're talking about match day sponsorship, other revenue streams that will be lost if games go ahead behind closed doors. There are so many things to factor in. Each individual club situation will be different in terms of the strength of contracts that they have when commercial revenue loss is obvious on match days. You know, you can be able to tell what... If you looked at the 6 games that Salford have left at home, say, for instance, or 5 games that we have left, I could profile for you quite quickly what revenue we would lose to the end of the season. I can also do it from a commercial point of view quite quickly, so each club will be able to assess their economic loss quite quickly and be able to put that forward to the FA and the Premier League to say, this is the trouble I'm in.
You said before about certain clubs could go under or be really struggling. Obviously, your situation, the 5 lads, Peter Lim involved, that's not going to happen to Salford. But would it get to a situation where you had to actually put money in, or you're actually allowed under FFP rules to put money in this situation?
Yeah, we will. I mean, every club will. So every club will have to put more money in to cover for what's happening at the moment. You're right, we're in a more fortunate position than other clubs, so I don't sit here complaining or whinging about our situation, but I do worry about other clubs who are so finely tuned that haven't got the contingency in place or the ownership that's essentially able to support it. It will be a real problem. Money will have to go in to cover the revenue losses because some clubs are so it won't just be the lower league clubs, by the way. There'll be championship clubs here who are finely tuned, who have obviously large revenues on match days and other revenue streams that would be at risk, that would be under real strain here and real pressure. And until they present their cases to football, which is the FA and the Premier League, the FA won't know and the Premier League won't know, but I'm sure, well, I pretty much know that's what's happening at the moment, that each football club will be putting their case forward. We have not been paid as Salford City for clubs for players that we have on loan at other clubs now for a few weeks. So we won't get that money at this moment in time. Now, we're not calling upon those clubs to give us that money either. We're saying ultimately we understand what's going on here. But there'll be clubs who basically have got transfer fees due. The clubs who've got transfer fees due in instalments from other years, from loan players that will be basically not getting paid. Would that work the other way, though? Would you have clubs you have to pay who might be struggling, and you can say, OK, I'm not trying. No, you're right.
You know what I mean? You say, well, OK, we're OK. We could actually help that team.
We, as Salford City, will pay other clubs for our loan players, as we have promised we will do. We can do, but we are not the what would be standard example of a League Two club. So we will pay the clubs that we got, I think 6 players, 7 players on loan. We'll pay the clubs that we've got those loan players due, but we aren't getting paid at the moment.
Yeah, but what I mean is you're in a position where you can actually help other clubs, so you're not taking payment, but you're actually giving the payments.
We will give the payments, but there are clubs who won't be getting the money and can't pay it, and just haven't got the money to be able to pay it, and they're the clubs that not just in the Football League. There'll become some clubs in the Premier League who are very worried at this moment in time, who need that revenue, not just in the lower leagues, but in the Premier League as well. And there'll be clubs who are finely tuned, they'll be really worried, that need that support quite quickly.
Gary, are there clubs that will go under?
My hometown club has gone under because of financial mismanagement outside of the coronavirus crisis, but it would be wrong of football to allow a club to go under because of this. I think this is a genuine out of left field event that no one could have predicted, that no one could have had contingency funding in place to allow for. There will be clubs like the one behind me here that will have the cash reserves to be able to get through it, and there'll be other clubs as well get through. But there will be clubs who will go under without support packages in place quite quickly, I think, Kelly. And like I said to you earlier on, I know there are National League clubs are all clubbing together to put their financial cases as one to the FA and the Football League and the Premier League to say, look, this is what we need. If we don't get it, we'll lose 23 clubs. You cannot lose 23 clubs out of the National League. You cannot lose 10 clubs out of the EFL. You cannot lose 3 Premier League clubs. There has to be a package put in place. And I'm sure, I don't know this, but I'm sure that's what's happening here, that there's a fund in place already for EFL clubs that you can call upon, but there will need to be potentially more money put forward if the crisis extends.
Do you think certain Premier League clubs, you mentioned Manchester United, my club also Liverpool, do you think the real biggest clubs in this country could be in a situation where they could help other clubs, and talking about what you're doing at Salford, there must be payments between clubs, there must be transfer fees had to be paid at certain times. Can you defer them? But actually the biggest clubs actually pay them early. Little things like that between clubs.
I think rather than, say, Manchester United helping Club X in League Two, I think it will come essentially as a single decision by the Premier League, the FA and the EFL, that there will be a fund put in place, similar to what the government have done with that £330 billion announcement that was made 2 days ago. There will be a fund, I think there's already been one put forward, 50 million for EFL clubs. There will be a fund put forward which clubs will be able to call upon. They'll obviously have to show proof of financials and the situation that they're in, but there will be a fund put forward to save football, I'm sure, because if it doesn't come, it will cause clubs to go under.
Well, Bryan Swanson alongside me, of course, in the studio. Bryan, you've got details. You've been speaking to Mark Bullingham, haven't you?
Yeah, I spoke to the FA Chief Executive on this precise point earlier this week after the postponement of the European Championships, and he said that yes, the Football Association are in talks with the government. Shortly before this show I did ask the DCMS what is the latest on those talks, and it still very much remains talks ongoing. Football ultimately and clubs are businesses, and the feeling is within the game that they should be offered that same level of protection, because it's worth remembering we saw the EFL's £50 million rescue package yesterday, agreed by the EFL to help offer some short-term relief for their 71 clubs. The Premier League gives around £140 million a season in solidarity payments and youth development payments. It's also worth remembering, Kelly, that the Premier League clubs put an awful lot into the economy. A report by Ernst & Young in 2016-17 said more than £3.3 billion in taxes were paid collectively across the game. So football does energise economies, but the message that I keep hearing from clubs is that they are looking to the government right now for that advice. They are looking for some sort of clarity on how they can survive longer term. But to echo Gary's point there, the clear message is that something will be done in terms of some sort of a rescue fund, because ultimately the time is running out, particularly on some of those smaller clubs.
Coming up, we will be asking some of your questions to the guys. It's your last chance if you want to get them in. It's at Sky Sports News on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDebate. And we'll be talking about some of the initiatives that may be underway to try and help clubs out at this really difficult time. Hello, welcome back to the debate. Jamie Carragher and Gary Neville are in Manchester, keeping their sensible distances from each other, and an even more sensible one from me, who's down here in London. Guys, we were talking before about the rescue packages that are in place, and the fact that there is a real support for the clubs that might be struggling, or we hope there's going to be a real support for the clubs that might be struggling. However, what we should talk about is what's already been happening and all the measures that have been taken so far. I've seen Manchester United, for example, the club behind you, are going to be paying their staff until the end of the season.
It's about doing the right thing at this moment in time, and the big thing is obviously not exposing any of your employees and family members to issues of health or giving them health problems. But the main thing from an economic point of view is reassurance. And I think Manchester United making that statement today is a welcome one. I think every club will follow suit that can in the next few days and take decisive actions. Even I think Hearts and what they've done today is decisive. It might not be popular with their staff, it might not be something that gives the game very much comfort, but if the owners of Hearts can only afford to pay out of the cash that they've got in their bank that amount of money, at least they've communicated early to their staff. And I think early communication and clear communication is absolutely vital. And I think that the Premier League, football, sport, can take the lead and really demonstrate to business, to everybody in the country and to government that, you know, we are a resilient bunch in the UK and that we can look after each other. I know that there is a sense probably over the last 20, 30 years that the country has become more detached and people are more selfish, but I do think in moments like this that you essentially can create a great deal of positivity from it, and people do need to stand up, that can stand up and look after each other, and that's obviously from a health perspective but also from an economic perspective, because people are absolutely worried to death at this moment in time about being able to cover their bills, their rent, their mortgage. They're worried about being kicked out of the house. They have families to feed. We, the whole country, have to give that reassurance now, today, yesterday, and I think the government, within the timeframes that they've got, are acting quite quickly, but they need to get on with it now and keep going and keep going. And there's another announcement tomorrow. They have to give reassurance and comfort to everybody quickly.
And while people are extremely concerned, there are genuine worries that they have at the moment, Jamie. Is there a sense that the return of football might mark the beginning of things returning to normal, that's the significance of it? Obviously, it doesn't have any significance next to the very real problems that people are facing, but the return of football might be the start of everything starting to turn again.
Well, I think for supporters, I think even before the corona virus come in, football was always seen as a release, whether you work all week and you've got the game on not just on a Saturday. Now we know it's Saturday, Sunday, Monday, sometimes Friday with ourselves, but it was always that thing of you looking forward to something. Now, listen, normal times just going to work all week. This is obviously completely different. As Gary rightly said, people are actually worried about actually feeding the families. Kids are now off school. You're thinking about it yourself, how parents who send the kids to school are actually going to give them, you know, the lunch in the middle of the day, but they don't normally have to worry about that. That's taken care of at school. So there are all these different worries that people have got. So, but football always was there, I think, as something to sort of look forward to, of take it out of tough times, whether that was maybe unemployment or your job not paying well enough. It was always okay, maybe not go on the match, but how did my team get on? Something to support, something to get behind, something to bring people together. And now we're in a lot tougher times, really, health-wise, but also financially, as Gary's just mentioned as well. So you do hope that football could bring people together. I don't hope, I think it will bring people together. And of course, there's a lot of different people in this country who have different passions. But the one big thing, I think, in this country, or the biggest passion probably, certainly sporting-wise, is football. And I think there will almost be maybe celebration's the wrong way, but that sort of, yes, we're back. Come on, can we use football? And I think even think of governments in the past and prime ministers who actually used football to almost enhance their own position or be seen at certain games, or players. Everyone knows the power, certainly, of the game, and I think we have got a huge responsibility, even ourselves, in, you know, promoting the games when they are back, and that feel-good factor, really, because I think everyone knows when the football's back, it means we're on the way back as a country, I would say. So that's why it was probably reassuring in some ways that these dates are getting put in now, and it makes you, give you a little bit of hope that hopefully the coronavirus will be on its way out at that stage. Probably still not sure, it may get pushed back further, but as I said, when the football's back, I think we'll feel like the country's back.
It's nice to see that the two of you have chosen to spend time together when you don't actually have to. But other than returning to work and returning to work with each other, how have you been spending this enforced break?
I mean, I've been the last week locked on video calls probably for 6-7 hours a day.
To me.
Not to him. You know, I feel like I've got a headache here, which is like working with him. Just looking at what the impact is over the next 3 to 4, 5, 6 months, obviously in the businesses that, you know, I'm a shareholder in, and just putting the packages in place that need to be put in place to make sure that our employees get comfort and reassurance, and taking a real defensive position and a conservative position from a point of view of this could go on for 6 months, could it go on for 8 months, what's going to happen, trying to assess it, speaking to partners, speaking to banks, speaking to obviously our employees, and making sure that we put ourselves in a position whereby first and foremost people get reassurance that are employed by us, but next thinking about how we start to come out of it, and that next week it'll be how we start to come out of this in terms of the, you know, few months after it's finished. Because this, when you have a crisis like this, it isn't just the period of the crisis. When you have to start off again, you've got that sort of lag and that difficult moment still to exist where people are building confidence again. So this is a real problem. At this moment in time, I just keep thinking every single day about, and I've not thought of anything else for the last few days than about essentially how people don't lose their jobs, don't lose their houses, don't lose what they've got, because it would just be completely wrong. And it feels to me at this moment in time like there shouldn't be almost like a leading party in government. Almost feels like everybody should have the same aims. Almost feels like, you know, Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the SNP, the leader of the Lib Dems, the leader of all of the parties should be stood there together on a stage every single night saying, we're going to make sure that every single person in this country is looked after. And to be fair, Boris Johnson has said that today in his address, but now he has to follow through with it, and it'd be nice to see some all-party decisions being made where everybody's, you know, you feel like everyone's together. There doesn't need to be politics at this moment in time. You're talking about putting people in the whole country, the 64 million people, first, and making sure that they've got everything that they need in this next 3, 4, 5, 6 months until they can fend for themselves again and get back on an even keel.
But I think, as you alluded to, the measures that you've taken lend weight to the comments on and the requests that you're making of the various footballing authorities. The fact that you've done this now, you've been in a similar position, and you've acted in a way that you're asking them to do.
Yeah, I mean, this hotel has got 135 bedrooms, and it was probably a week ago that we first contacted the NHS, the health services in Greater Manchester, when I saw an article along with our management team that said that there's going to be a shortage of beds for health workers who need to isolate away from their families who potentially are showing symptoms of coronavirus, and there's going to be a huge shortage of beds. We've had the meeting today, which puts the processes in place for health workers to come and stay here. And we've got 135 beds here and 40 beds at a hotel in Manchester, so there's 175 beds. And we're being told today that those beds will be fully occupied by Sunday evening, that the crisis is acute. And that's scary when you think of that sort of information that's required, when you think of the hundreds and thousands of health workers who can't go into work at the moment because of them showing symptoms. So they're trying to find safe accommodation away from that in obviously beyond their own homes. So, you know, our 175 beds, we're being told, are going to be full by Sunday, Monday with health workers. There's going to be thousands more hotel beds needed and other accommodation needed in these coming months to get through this, because it just doesn't exist. And I'm sure that the communications that I've been seeing over this last 24 hours in Greater Manchester, that other hotels are willing to do the same thing, and people will just muck in and pull together and get through this and make sure that they do the right thing more often than not, I think.
Well, it looks like you've done the right thing in this instance, for sure. Bryan?
Adapt to support the new needs of their local communities in light of the coronavirus pandemic. We have seen a number of clubs initiating their own initiatives, telephone calls to elderly and isolated groups, supporting food banks, utilising club minibuses and health buses to support socially isolated people, creating helplines for people in the community. This is really football coming together at a time of crisis, and it's really trying to offer their communities as much as they can.
Coming up next, we're going to be asking Jamie and Gary some of your questions. And some Premier League footballers have spent a lot of time at home, and this is one of the ways they've been passing it with the Stay Home Challenge.
The all-new Mazda CX-30 with Mazda M
Hello, welcome back to the debate, and it's time to put your tweets to Gary Neville and to Jamie Carragher. We're going to start with one from Mark Edwards, who says, do you think that next season would work playing half the games when it eventually starts? So I assume the way to do that would be to do away with home and away to make that more random. What do you think?
No, I'm not sure about that, because I think the home and away situation, I have said before about being creative next season, but I still think it has to be the 38 Premier League games. I'm thinking about actually UEFA, maybe looking at the Champions League, those international breaks, maybe if you could take them out the calendar. There may something have to do with the domestic cup competitions within our league, but I still think it would have to be 38 games, and that's the problem with finishing this season. It has to feel equal. I actually look at the cup competitions this season in some ways as well, because a cup competition, whether you're in the quarter-finals or the third round of an FA Cup or you're in the semi-final, everyone's still equal within that round. And there may be a case even this season of cup competitions going, if this goes on, crisis goes on even further, to try and squeeze games together at some stage. But I don't think you can actually do anything to the league next season. I think it's around the league where UEFA or the Premier League want to try and be clever.
How could you dismiss? You were very protective of the Premier League continuing to the end of the season when football resumes. How can you dismiss the FA Cup and the Champions League, knowing that the FA Cup brings so much revenue into the FA, which funds grassroots football? That doesn't seem to be a consistent position.
No, what I mean by that is that I think the Premier League, everyone's different. It's not equal. Someone's at the top, someone's at the bottom, someone's got different things. I think if you're in the quarter-final, where are we in the quarter-final of the Champions League? Or we're in the quarter-finals of Europe, or the last 16, yeah, Liverpool aren't. But everyone within that 16 is then equal. Say, for instance, what's happened now had happened with 10 games into the season, and there was not that much difference between everyone. I think you could make a case for voiding the season or starting again, really. I think in cup competitions, everyone is equal. I'm not saying getting rid of them. And what I'm saying is, if this goes on and on and on, you're getting to a stage where you're actually in June, July, August, and you're thinking...
If you're Paris Saint-Germain or Manchester City, who are desperate for that Champions League, you're not going to agree to that.
No, but UEFA aren't as well. That's their Super Bowl, isn't it? That's why they're saying June the 30th. And you also have to think of being what's in it next season. My only thing on that is that if something had to give, if you win the FA Cup, I don't think it means that something about next season, if you've won the FA Cup that season. If you win the Champions League, you've won the Champions League that season. What I mean by the league is that you're actually affecting things for next season. So whether you're in the Premier League, whether you're in the Champions League, do you understand what I mean? Listen, I don't want nothing to go. I'm just saying I don't think it's realistic. The 30th of June, I think they've said for a fact. I think it could be at least another month on top, maybe 6 weeks.
On that question of June the 30th, which you mentioned, Andy Ho's got in touch to say, how do clubs deal with contracts ending June the 30th? It's a two-part question, because he goes on to ask how it could possibly affect Manchester City's appeal going into next season. Potentially. So let's deal with the first part of that question. What are the practicalities that clubs have to deal with if they've got players whose contracts end on June the 30th? I know you've touched on this a little bit already.
Look, it's a legal minefield, but I'd like to think that with collaboration, a word that you mentioned before, that the PFA would be reasonable, but also the clubs would be reasonable. If the league has to be played into next season, let's say it goes into the third week in July, would players say, I want extra money for those 3 weeks, as an example, just because I've got a contract that's run out? I don't think they would. I think they would be viewed very badly by the game, in essence, because they're not doing the right thing. This is a crisis, and this is essentially unprecedented times. So I think the PFA, the players, the clubs, the leagues, the associations will all do something in the right spirit, understanding that selfishness is not a quality that needs to be seen in these next few months. It needs to be about collaboration and making things work. So there will have to be some leeway and give from all sides and compromise. In terms of the legal situations, I mean, I don't see how you can have any legal situations in the whole country, let alone with regards to football, because you've got a situation whereby you have to bring together people into a courtroom. We know that people have been told not to gather in places. How do you corroborate your case? How do you bring together people to try and do things? I know you can do video conference, and I've been doing it all week. I'm sure everybody in the country nearly is doing it at this moment in time, but it isn't a way to run legal cases, and it isn't a way to run court cases. So I think Manchester City's case is quite simple. You would just put it just kick it down the road and bump it down the road, and maybe say, okay, there is a window or a holiday, which things I'm sure will have to be put on holiday in many different cases in the world. We'll do this for the season after as an example, and just say, okay, you can go in it next season, but we'll hear it for the season after if that's the case, because there's no way legal cases can go forward. It's just not the primary thought of anybody at this moment in time. Legal cases of what would be a non-essential matter. Obviously, there are essential legal cases, but then there are non-essential ones. I would put the Manchester City case as a non-essential legal case, personally.
It's looking, Jamie, as though that could be extended. And given what Gary said and the delays that are going to take place, it's possible that it could delay it.
Yeah, yes, it could. And I think Gary's right. I think the situation with Man City, obviously, blew up a few months ago. That was the talk of everything. Now this is completely taken over, and rightly so, and so many things now have to be put on the back burner. In terms of actually time and when this season finishes and the next one starts, you just think how will, I think it's CAS they're going to take on UEFA over the ban. Whether there'd actually be enough time there to come to a conclusion. I'm sure whatever comes out of it, City would appeal again and go on. So I'm probably with Gary in some ways in that we're in unprecedented times, that you almost say, well, this has to be put 12 months back, where actually City City will make the Champions League, they'll finish in the top 4 positions. So they're actually, yes, you're in it next season, but we're getting to the bottom of the right or wrongs of it, and maybe you look 12 months on.
Kev McMahon has asked, what do you think about the idea of football becoming a summer sport until the Qatar World Cup? That's it. That's the question. You can answer if you like.
Yeah, I said earlier on, I feel that the least of my worries, and I don't know whether your worries, are the calendar, because I think once the sort of, if you like, this crisis is over and the coast is clear, I genuinely think that footballers, football clubs, the authorities and associations will play as many games physically possible in a week, in a month, in a 3-month period to get everything back on track. We know that in, say...
Do you think it's possible to get back on... I don't think it's possible to get back on track.
Back on track, it might be that it goes into September, October this season, but my point is, if you think about the Christmas period...
The Euros they've said the Euros are starting at a certain time next summer, so it will have to be... So they will have to do something. What do you think they can do next season?
We know over Christmas that the clubs play 4 games in 8 days. I think one year that we were going to win the league, we had a backlog of fixtures because of FA Cup replays, and that's why FA Cup replays were scrapped. I think it was the 97 season, we played, I think, on a Saturday, a Monday, a Thursday and a Sunday. So that was 4 games in a week. It is possible for a 6-week, 8-week period that there might be 4 games a week in there. There might be possible that you've got 4 international windows of 2 weeks, which is 8 weeks, that one of those 2 weeks is given back to the clubs, and essentially there might be 3 international games per 2-week period rather than 2. So I'm not concerned about squeezing more games in, because obviously players will understand, and clubs will understand, and physios will understand, and managers will understand that they can't complain about fixture congestion next season because of the circumstances that exist now, where we've got a global crisis. Football has to react and compromise. That means more games will have to be played in a shorter period of time. The real problem will be if this goes on for 12 months, 15 months, 18 months, God forbid, for the health of people in this country. But that's when I think football is just going to have to completely revisit what's going on, because it'll have lost the whole season next year, in essence. So I think at the moment, if Boris Johnson's 12-week announcement earlier on tonight, we believe, and there's no reason why we shouldn't do at this moment in time, and football was to resume in 14 weeks as an example, I've no problem, or I've no worries that football would react and compromise, and players would compromise and fit more games in. Players will be desperate to play football matches. Fans are desperate to get into stadiums. The people at home are desperate to watch football matches. So the idea that there's more football on for a 2-month period when it returns, I don't think will be the least of anyone's problems, or I don't concern myself with that at all.
We're going to have a slight change in tone, because you might have noticed, well, Cara, I know you've definitely noticed, that some of the footballers who've been staying at home have been doing the Stay Home Challenge on Instagram. This is Phil Foden, who managed to complete it reasonably well, I think. That's pretty impressive, very impressive there. Tammy Abraham also taking part in this stay-home challenge where you have to juggle the elusive toilet roll in order to get a load of keepy uppies and to impress your Instagram followers. So, Carragher, never one to buck a trend. You've decided that you would have a go at it. Let's take a look at what he's got. Let's see what Carragher had in his locker. Where are you off to? So this is Carragher. First go, not very well. Even your wife wasn't very impressed, Carragher. And eventually, Jamie Carragher, 1, 2. No, there's only 2 there. How many the next time? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I'll be honest, it wasn't as stylish as the others. But Gary, I notice you've got all the necessary equipment.
Here we go.
To answer the challenge. 2, 3.
Oh no, not quite.
I thought 3 was all right, but to be honest, you need to keep it wrapped up. It needs to be before anybody's opened it up. Guys, thank you very much for that, Gary. I'm sure you'll have another go again on Instagram. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for listening to us on The Debate. Coming up next on Sky Sports News, there's more on the extended suspension of the Premier League, and we'll find out how the governing bodies plan to protect the integrity of the competition.